All right, well, now we are in Proverbs in our discussion of the Old Testament wisdom literature. Proverbs is a book that contains what we might call wise sayings. Sometimes these are called short aphorisms. Aphorism is a word that means a short saying that conveys a particular point. You know, I hate to make this analogy, but fortune cookies and the fortunes in fortune cookies resemble proverbs in terms of their structure and their length. Now, not in terms of content, but in terms of structure and length, proverbs look a little bit like fortune cookie statements. You know, and these are short statements, such as a fool only listens to his own advice, and wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, or um, those sorts of short statements that convey a particular point. So the interesting thing about Proverbs is the outline of the book, because the first 9 chapters, okay, so chapters 1 through 9, right here, including the preamble, deal with the relationship between Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And the person who wrote Proverbs, typically that's said to be King Solomon, although if you look down here, sayings of the wise, sayings of Agur, King Lemuel, etc., at least these 3 sections appear to be written by others besides Solomon. So it's possible that Solomon took these and put them together. We don't know. But Solomon appears to have written at least 10 through 25 and possibly the introduction as well. These Proverbs, these first 9 chapters of Proverbs are not actually, they actually don't consist of these short sayings. Now, there are short sayings in these first 9 chapters, but the main point of chapters 1 through 9 is that a person can either follow Lady Wisdom or Lady Folly. Okay, and the point there is that there are 2 paths in life. There is the path of destruction, and there is the path of blessing, or the path of wisdom. And the proverbist's point is that in your actions, you can either choose folly or choose wisdom. And the person who writes these first 9 chapters, the point here, again, is to show that there is this twofold path that we can take, or 2 paths that we can take, but also to show the results of each path. The person who writes these first 9 chapters continually indicates that the person who goes after Lady Folly is a person who will end in destruction, who will end in their life being ruined, that will end in being away from God, not being under God's blessing, etc., versus a person who follows Lady Wisdom, who is blessed, who knows God, who fears the Lord, etc. One of the famous sayings of Proverbs is that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And what that means is the person who is wise is a person who fears God, a person who respects God, who wants to follow God, who wants to live under God's rule. Okay, and so a person who is wise wants to know God through obeying Him. A person who is foolish wants to live their own way. They want to do their own thing. They don't care about what God says. They don't care about God's instructions. They just do what they want. Now, one of the interesting parts of this first section here is that Lady Folly is often portrayed as an adulteress. And so one of the key sins in Proverbs, in terms of living foolishly, doing what you want, is adultery. And what we're going to see in the prophets next week is that Israel is often called an adulterer. And the reason that they're often called an adulterer is that God compares their sin, their idolatry, to adultery. In other words, they're worshiping other gods. They are going after false gods. They are worshiping idols. And God compares that to adultery. And so the interesting point here is that in Proverbs, by saying that doing your own thing, sinning, not obeying God, by saying that's adultery, the writer of Proverbs is comparing disobedience to idolatry. Okay, so both idolatry and disobedience are called adultery in different parts of the Bible. Here in Proverbs, it's disobedience. In the prophets, it's idolatry. And so we have this link between disobedience and idolatry here. So what the writer of Proverbs is saying is, by disobeying, you are being an idolater. You are worshiping an idol by disobeying God. You are worshiping something else besides God, which is causing you to do your own thing. And so, I think in the first week we talked about the fact that sin is not just disobedience, it's idolatry. And Proverbs really brings this point home because Proverbs says, well, your disobedience is directly related to idolatry. And sin is a result of not keeping our eyes on Jesus, not keeping our eyes on God, not worshiping God with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, so that by not doing that, we do our own thing. We go our own way. And so Proverbs compares sin to idolatry. So these first 9 chapters really make the point that you need to fear the Lord, you need to worship God alone, and in doing so, you will be wise. You will have wisdom, and you will therefore do the right thing. If you do not worship God, you are being an adulterer and an idolater, and you will do the wrong thing, which will result in destruction. So that's the first 9 chapters. That first 9 chapters sets up chapters 10 through 31. Because chapters 10 through 31 now are going to consist of these short, pithy statements, these aphorisms that will compare and contrast these two ways of doing things, this way of folly and this way of wisdom. So that in these next 21 chapters, what happens is that these short statements compare the way of the wise and the way of the fool. And as you read through these proverbs, you will see that. Now, these divisions here, sayings of the wise, sayings of Agur, sayings of King Lemuel, these aren't going to change the way that the proverbs are written. It's just indication that the author is changing throughout the book of Proverbs. Okay, and then finally we get to the poem of the virtuous woman, and again this sort of shifts away from these short, pithy statements to this final poem. And remember, we started out with Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. Proverbs again ends with a focus on a woman. And the focus on the woman here is this virtuous woman. It says in Proverbs 31:10, a virtuous woman who can find? And then it goes on to describe this virtuous woman. And then verse 31, the virtuous woman will be praised in the gates. And so again, Proverbs leaves us looking for this virtuous woman, this Lady Wisdom. And it's interesting, I think that the Bible is often portrayed as being about primarily men, but Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Solomon, these books are, Esther, these books are about finding this virtuous woman. And throughout the Old Testament, we're looking not only for this King Messiah, but also this virtuous woman, this bride of the King. Proverbs is one of these books that points us in that direction. And in the New Testament, the bride is the church. And so we have King Jesus, this man that we're looking for, but we also have the church, the bride of Christ. And in Proverbs, we're looking for a virtuous woman, which should indicate that by the New Testament comparing this woman in the Old Testament with the church, it should tell us the church should be a people who pursues wisdom, who is virtuous, who is wise. so that we are the bride that the king deserves. Moving on in the wisdom literature, we come to Ecclesiastes. Now, here's my recommendation for you as you read Ecclesiastes. Don't read this when you are in a bad mood. Do not read this when you are particularly depressed or sad, because the first 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes are going to make you depressed. If you don't get to chapter 12, you are going to be sad. And the reason for that is that Ecclesiastes has one main point, which is that you cannot find meaning in life apart from God. There is no meaning in life apart from God. And the book of Ecclesiastes, these first 11 chapters, chapter 1:12 through chapter 12:7, are about Kohelet, the preacher, trying to find meaning in life in everything else besides God. He tries to find meaning in life in marriage, in money, in sex, in power, in creation itself, in nature. He's trying to find meaning in life. And what he says in each of these quests is that ultimately these don't bring meaning. Marriage, money, power, sex, nature, none of that brings meaning to life. And his final conclusion is the reason for that is that only a relationship with God, only the fear of the Lord will bring meaning to your life. There is nothing else that will bring meaning. And so Ecclesiastes is difficult to work through if you don't read it all in one setting. It's this book that builds on itself. It builds and builds and builds and builds in terms of showing how nothing else brings meaning to the short statement at the end that only God brings meaning. Only a relationship with God, only the fear of the Lord will bring meaning to life. So as you read Ecclesiastes, don't get depressed because the good is coming at the end. You know, Ecclesiastes is a book, we think that it was probably written by Solomon. It's possible that it wasn't, but Solomon is the likely candidate. And the reason for that is that it's put in the canon with books written by Solomon, but also that authorship in the Bible tends to be related to somebody important in the Bible. And the time period here, the subject matter, the wisdom idea, all points to Solomon being the person who probably wrote it, as well as Proverbs on one side and then Song of Solomon on the other. It's probably written by Solomon as well. Song of Solomon is a book that might make you blush in some parts. It is a very erotic book. It's about a relationship between a man and a woman. But the indication is that it goes beyond just talking about the marriage relationship between this woman and this king. The language in Song of Solomon talks about this man and this woman using temple imagery. And the interesting part of that is that temple imagery, the man and the woman, the whole garden idea that's found in Song of Solomon. They're out in the woods. They're a man and the woman. They're beside streams, and they're with trees. There's jewels in there. All of that is garden imagery, but it's also temple imagery, and you have this man and this woman. And so the book, even though it's about the relationship between a man and a woman, it seems to be about the ultimate man and woman, who is not Adam and Eve, but who is Christ and the church. And so this picture is of this man and this woman, this restored man and woman, the restored garden that we're looking forward to, that we've been looking forward to in the whole Old Testament. And so this book is not just any man and woman, it's not just husband and wife in general, but it is the marriage relationship between Christ and the church. Now, we as husbands and wives should model our relationship off of that ultimate relationship, but we don't need to dumb down Song of Solomon to just about any man and woman. It's about Christ and the church because of that temple, garden, Adam and Eve language.